Thank you all for being here so much. This is such a great turnout for an event. I really appreciate that everyone could be here. Special thanks to the Writers Ed Committee. If everyone from the Writers Ed Committee would stand up, please. It's a great committee. I really hope that people maybe turn out for some of our meetings. Special thanks to Bo Bellinger, who arranged for the videotaping. So if you're watching later, thank you to Bo. Special thanks to the American Indians Writer Committee and the Latino Writers Committee for their support. There are a lot of committees here. So special thank you to them. Our panelists, who I hope need no introduction. You have the introduction in your hands. Really fantastic to sort of have them here tonight. I just wanted to start off this conversation with something that I saw at a college career center recently about guide for sort of how to deal with transitions. So set goals, be flexible, find mentors, join groups like the WGA, and use the news. So with that in mind, let's talk to our panelists. So I just sort of wanted to ask the panel, just to throw it open, what have you guys seen in the last 5 years? How are things different from maybe when you started? What is going on out there? It's just clear from the response right now, there's a lot more cable action going on. What trends in the industry are you all seeing?
You go. You're the agent. You start.
Please.
No, go ahead.
Ladies first.
Smaller staffs, more upper-level people and consulting producers on staffs, less staff writer slots available right now. That's what I'm seeing.
There's more jobs, but it's harder to get them.
Yep.
Because the business is such a moving target. It's more difficult for agents and managers to track all of the different places where a writer, especially a starting one or one that's in a second or third job, might get staffed. When I started, it was 1995. TV was in black and white and live. We had to fight velociraptors to get into the Universal lot. But it was actually, a pretty cut and dry algorithmic process. The staffing happened, between February and May. You wanted to try to get on a 10 o'clock police procedural. You wrote an NYPD Blue, and you got on Sequest from that. And now you're really talking about something where the onus is much more on you as an individual writer to kind of brand yourself and to write the types of scripts for the types of shows you want to write. When I was starting out, my agent would say, you want to do science fiction, don't write a science fiction script for God's sake, and you would wind up having to kind of kowtow to the idea that there was a mature type of television writing. Today, it's really on you to kind of decide what kind of writer you want to be, what kind of shows you want to work on, and guide your representation toward the jobs. And so it's you have to be more entrepreneurial, but the business has a greater amount of receptors. You just have to find out what they are.
Andrew, as an agent, would you agree with that? Or?
Yeah, a couple of things to add. As you can see, there's a lot more drama writers here than comedy writers. I think part of that is the influx of cable and streaming. Think about how many cable networks there are that are purely doing drama, not doing comedy at all. Similarly, comedy has a tough time translating to the international marketplace. I think something that we haven't quite touched on yet is that the international marketplace is only expanding, becoming more and more influential in terms of what's getting made here. China hasn't really become an open market yet. That's going to happen in the next few years here. Very curious to see what happens to our staffs when that happens. But Javi's totally right. Today you have to think about yourself not only as a brand but as a business. Where do you want to be as a writer in the next 5-10 years, and then help your agents dictate that. Quick stat for you: there's over 400 scripted shows on television right now. 400. It's gonna be 450 to 500 the next year or two. Something to think about. You can't get lost in that mix. That's on you guys to help brand yourselves.
Your agents and casting no aspersions, Andrew, they can't track all 450 shows that are there. So it's your job it's what Andrew said. I see you as the CEO of your own business, and your business is your career. And you're the one that should be finding out what the shows are, what you have to bring to those shows, and let your agents know. Give them the marching orders.
LaToya, how's the LaToya business going?
It's going pretty well.
Could be better.
You've had some success on a couple of different dramas, and how have you managed one show jumping to another one? How has that process been for you?
It's been pretty seamless. I've been very fortunate to work with some really incredible showrunners and work on shows that I really loved. So what I try to do on every show that I work on is really immerse myself in the world of the show. So, for example, the last show that I was working on was Turn, which is about spies during the Revolutionary War. And I happen to have some really deep, probably shameful nerd knowledge about the Revolutionary War. And so that was very helpful to me. So when I went in to meet with my showrunner, it was just a geek fest about muskets and military, flanking and stuff like that. So it was just great to be able to find a place for that. So I would just say, like, as a writer, whatever show you're jumping on to, make sure you're digging into what the show is and not be afraid to let your geek flag fly.
I'll say, just to add to that, I actually was in this conversation earlier today. LaToya just gave an example where she was incredibly fortunate to work on a show that actually spoke to a specific interest that she had. Most of the time it's not going to be the case. Most of the time, unfortunately, you're going to be on a show that, for the most part, you don't love, right?
You kind of love it, I would hope. I mean, you're working, right?
So my point is that, working better than not working, eating better than not eating.
Yes.
But my point is, I was talking to someone who was going in on a meeting for a pilot. He read the pilot, didn't love the pilot. So we talked about find something to connect within the pilot, whether it's a character or a moment or a theme. This particular pilot is essentially about a misfit living in a place where he has no place being. I think just that theme of being a misfit, I think everyone in this business has that understanding. Find something to connect with in the show. You're not gonna love a lot of the stuff you're working on. Find something to connect with.
The majority of our lives as television writers are basically a study in abnegation, and you need to kind of settle with that. The fact is, most of the time, you're not going to be working on the song of your own soul, and sometimes you're going to be working on the song of the soul of a person whom you don't entirely respect. And that's not an unusual state of affairs for most of us, because most of us have titanic egos. And that's, one of the things that you have to learn is, if you are getting if you read a pilot and your agent gets you a showrunner meeting on that pilot, you better try your hardest to get that job.
Exactly.
And that's just sort of what it is. I mean, it's like the point where you begin to actually select what work you want or don't want to do is far further down a field in your career. And this, being able to know that you're going to be of service, not of self-expression, is a huge, huge thing that you have to do when you're a starting writer, and you have to understand. And when you go in, what you have to understand is you're there to learn how to write like your showrunner. You're there to execute the showrunner's format, and you're there to learn those skills, because the majority of your career is going to be taken up with those skills. That is the craft that you have to actually learn before you get to be a showrunner.
That's where our egos get in the way, unfortunately.
Oh, yeah.
Jessica, you and I representing comedy. Woo.
Is there a signal or a thing for comedy? Or
You're not privy to that.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you missed it already. But I think
It's the sound of people laughing at things you say, Javi. Oh, never had that.
Doesn't hurt. It's interesting as we talk about cable, dramas going to cable, because I feel like comedy might be going digital, and I think we've both had some experience on the digital side, and maybe you could just sort of talk a little bit as you've gone from kids to premium cable to now digital, and just where are you seeing the comedy opportunities right now?
I mean, I've had kind of a weird career in that I did a little bit of everything. I started out in kids, and I did both kids animation and kids live action, and then I did adult animation. I wrote for Robot Chicken, and then after that I went to premium cable and wrote for Silicon Valley. And then I went to digital, wrote for Bajillion Dollar Properties, and then I went back to adult animation and wrote for Rick and Morty. So I've kind of done a little bit of everything, and things that I've noticed is that there are so many opportunities in digital now, where everything's going digital, especially when things get rejected in network and in like cable even. There are all these digital outlets that are like, we want it. Like, I have a pilot now that was originally purchased by MTV, and then MTV passed, and now it's gone to full screen, And I feel like the digital companies aren't afraid to pick up things that are kind of in turnaround. Whereas before, a lot of the traditional networks, if something's in turnaround, as soon as one person rejects something, nobody wants it anymore. You know, there's a stigma attached to it because it's been rejected before. And I feel like with digital, people don't care about that. They just want content. And the other thing I've noticed is that now that there's all these like outlets for comedy, the definition of comedy isn't so strict anymore. It's not just a sitcom. You have all these kind of great shows that really walk the line between comedy and drama, and it's a lot more fluid now, which I really love.
It's interesting how it's changing. Carole, Charlene, by the way, did a fantastic job with the WGA helping put this event together. If we could please give her a hand. And one of the things that you kind of mentioned in the green room, Carole, was how important it is for writers to have a headshot, and that is something that writers might underestimate. And maybe you could sort of speak to some other things that maybe writers are underestimating as we're going into these staff meetings.
Sure. Just know before you go into a meeting, people are going to look at your Facebook, they're going to look at your Twitter, they're going to Google you and get an impression of who you are before you even walk in the door. It's important that you look, you're writers, we don't expect you to look like models, but you should look professional. Writer model, it's a whole new thing these days. And you have to brand yourself. I hate that term because it's so corporate, but it's true. The more you can say who you are, the more you have sort of a personal PR strategy, the more your agents will be able to, when they pick up the phone and call on your behalf, they get about 2 sentences to tell who you are. And you want those 2 sentences to be great sentences so that the person who's listening is going to go, yeah, we want to meet with this person. So it's knowing your story, it's knowing what you write, what your tone is, being really clear about that, and that your digital presence is positive sort of across the board. You don't want to come across in your Twitter profile as bitter and hostile. That's not going to help you because they will look at that.
Yeah, I did not think about that. Gonna have
Cam
to
is
delete
going to
some tweets.
excuse himself right now for unrelated reasons.
Javi, we've already spoken a little bit to this, but expertise, passion, enthusiasm, these are things that staff writers can try to sell themselves in meeting. Is there any other way that a staff writer can really say, hey, I can help your show?
Well, I mean, it's exactly what you just said, and here's the thing, and I hit on this a lot because a showrunner meeting is like a first date, except it's a first date where the showrunner's already read your material. So if like they've gone to your Twitter and seen your tweets and they've read your script and you're going in, it's like you basically, you know, and I hate to put it so crassly, but basically you could get unlaid. Sort of what could happen in that meeting, you know, because you walk in late. I mean, everybody wants this to work out, you know, everybody wants it to work out. The showrunner wants to be like, oh my God, thank God I found the right person and all that. And honestly, what you need to do, you know, and it's advice that I you know, I hear stories of people coming in with notes or and things that are written out and pitches and all sorts of stuff to meetings. And frankly, what you're trying to sell to a person who, if you're going into a meeting right before the upfronts with a showrunner, this is the most stressed out human being alive, you know, and what you really want to prove to that person is that it's going to be okay for them to hang out with you more than they do with their wife or husband, you know, because that's what it's going to be. They're going to spend 8 to 10 hours in a room with you. And you know, so a lot of it is do all of the things they tell you to do. Know the show. Figure out what you like about the show. Be ready to speak about it extemporaneously. Have pitches for stories if you must and all that. And then like an actor going on stage, forget about all that. Because actors learn their lines so they can forget them. And then all of a sudden, everything appears very natural, and it's Shakespeare. And you're like, wow, it sounds so natural. Yeah, they forgot it. And it's basically the same thing. Learn everything and then forget it and focus on having an experience in that room where you're actually hanging out with that person and, you know, joining, you know, having a conversation with them on a human level that proves to them that, hey, you know, we could hang for 10 hours a day. And frankly, you know, part of that process of meeting a showrunner, you know, if you don't bond with that person particularly well, you're probably not going to get an offer. And you have to kind of it is the most important thing that will ever happen to you as a television writer is that first showrunner meeting you're ever going to have, or the second one, or the third one, the fourth one, the fifth one, right? But at the same time, you have to let go of the expectation that everything hinges on this meeting, because if you are projecting that energy, you're most likely not going to project what that person's going to experience of you in the writer's room, which is that you're cool, you're chill, you can hang out, you can bounce around ideas. And, I've had showrunner meetings where the show didn't even come up. Because you just sit there, you hang out, you start talking. Next thing you know, you're telling them about how you used to play Dungeons and Dragons. They're excited. You're talking about that. The hour's done. They say goodbye, and then you get an offer. And it's honestly, it is that simple. It is knowing everything and being willing to let it all go to talk about Dungeons and Dragons, preferably.
I think just to add to what Javi's touching on, I think there's actually a lesson in acting they teach you that they don't teach you in writing. I think they should. In acting, it's important to engage the other person from their perspective. As writers, you're so internal, you're so in your own head all the time. I think there's oftentimes we forget that it's about them also. So when you're in these meetings beforehand, think about if you were the one hiring, what would you be looking for, right? Who would you want to hire? And be that person, right? Think about it from their perspective. Two, something that we talk about a lot is whatever the meeting, the showrunner meeting, exec meeting, a meeting with a friend, a meeting with another writer, you got to go into the meeting believing that you're going to win the meeting. It's a competition. Every single meeting is a competition. And you have to have the perspective, you're going to win the meeting. How do you win it? What takes to win it? So think about those things for yourself. They're going to be different for you than for me than for anyone here. So think about those things. What makes you different? Third, another stat I'll throw out there. Think about what Javi was saying. How many meetings is this showrunner taking? How many meetings is this exec taking, right? Multiply that by the years this person's been doing it. It's a lot of people. So winning the meeting is more than just this hour. Winning means beating out the other people, the history, right? How do I beat out all those other people that this person knows? Think about that.
Let me I'm sorry, just 1 second. That makes me so nervous hearing that. I don't know about anybody
It
else.
makes me stressed. I was like, oh my God, I'm like sweating now because of that. It's like, woo.
I want to win the panel now. I want to excited.
Win.
I think it's being your authentic self and being your best self. If I had to worry about going in and winning, I would just freeze up. I don't know, you guys, you're writers, what do you think?
Like, I would never have gotten any job if I went in thinking, oh my God, I have to win the meeting. Like, one of the things that I always tell myself before I go into a showrunner meeting is have fun. And I'm not even kidding. I tell myself that because it can be so stressful if you think about, oh my God, the consequence if I don't get this job. I haven't had a job in, 3 months or whatever. Just try to have fun, be yourself. And just to stress something that Javi talked about, I think it's really important to follow the flow of conversation. So you're going to go in that meeting, you're like, oh my God, I got to make sure they know I know the pilot, they know I know the characters, they know I know this and that. Just go in, obviously know that stuff, but follow the flow of conversation where you feel free to talk about Game of Thrones for like 5 minutes. You know what I mean? Like, don't be so obsessed with making sure you tick off all your bullet points. I say this as a recovering perfectionist, so just be willing to let it go.
2 revelatory pieces of advice that I was given. One is, I know it's really awkward at meetings because the type of staffing meetings we go on, it's not like a traditional job interview. Like if you're interviewing for like a corporate job, like at Sears or I don't know, another place that's a corporation, like you go in, you have a resume, you've read like, these are all the things, like what are your weaknesses? Oh, I'm too good at everything. Like what the questions are going to be and you know how you're supposed to behave and you're supposed to be wearing a suit and all this stuff. But like for a staffing meeting, it's so like, it's simultaneously casual but also a job interview, but it almost feels like it's an elephant in the room, the job that you're not supposed to openly talk about and be like, oh, and P.S. you should hire me because I'm the best candidate, like it just feels really awkward in the middle of a conversation. And the great piece of advice I got was like, you just take control of the conversation. Like a good way to transition into it naturally is when you go into the meeting, you're going to talk about like your background and like like your credits and what you've been working on and things like that. And you're going to talk about the pilot and what the showrunner wants for the show. And so the first piece of advice is you ask them like, hey, like what kind of staff do you want? Because this is like our version of fantasy football where we all have like these, I want this type of writer, I want this many, I want stand-ups and I want, everybody has like, they're thinking about what type of team they want to put together for their baby project, know? And so as they're telling you about all this, you're thinking like, how do I fit into this? You know, like what are my strengths as a writer and as somebody in the room? How would I fit into this person's vision of a perfect team? So you already know like whether or not you would fit into it. I mean, if you want a job, you better fit into their vision. And the other thing is then you can say like, okay, like now that I know what you're looking for, like, let me tell you what I'm like in the room. This is the kind of writer I am in the room. Like when everyone's doing this, like I'm the person who does that. You know, I'm the person who is a joke machine, or I'm the person who's really into like emotional arcs, or I'm the person who's really into dialogue and stuff like that, you know, or I'm the person where if everyone's stuck, I'll just start telling stories about my personal life so that we can all mine my, you know, embarrassing moments for the good of the show. And that's a good way to kind of get into like why you're a candidate for this job without it being so weird and awkward and like a corporate job interview. It was such a revelation for me when I heard that, and I was like, oh, I've been doing it all wrong for years.
I'm so going to lose that meeting if we're ever up against each other. But I will just sort of speak on what Andrew was saying, though. I do get a little competitive about it, and what I try to do is I try to win the pre-meeting, which is like I try to come at it from as many angles as possible so that when I'm walking into that room, it's a comfortable place. We maybe have a person in common that we can talk about, or I've done my research so I know what their favorite shows are a little bit. So I do get a little competitive in that sense and do want to put my best self forward in that way. I'm going to pivot a little just because this is something that's come up recently, and Andrew, maybe you can speak to this. I've heard that staff writer deals are changing. I've heard that there are some cable networks that might have you on for 3 seasons at the staff writer level because of their shortened orders, but I've also heard there are some major studios that are even advocating for 2 years at staff writer level, and I just wanted to see, is that something you're seeing?
Yeah, I was talking to someone about this today, an attorney. Staffing deals are getting more and more complicated, especially at the lower levels. There are certain studios, ABC Studios being one of them, that actually mandate a certain episode count to get promoted. So let's say
Warner's is doing that too, yeah.
Warner's has been doing that for a few years. Anyway, I think it's going to be the norm over the next few years. So basically what that means is if you've been on a cable show for 10 episodes for 2 years as staff writer, ABC Studios won't actually promote you to story editor until the 23rd episode. So they'll actually try to keep you as staff writer for a 3rd season. So it's incredibly penalizing, something that we fought back a lot. We just did a deal where we actually had to break down the specific episode count so that by the 23rd episode worked on this specific thing at this credit, they would get bumped up. And it was like episode 7 of a season whatever on this show. So it's getting really crazy. Just be aware that, you know, if you actually do the math, that means you're not getting to ESE co-producer until season 6, season 7, right? So what I'm trying to do is appealing to the showrunner of like, listen, if you were in this person's shoes, it takes 7 years to get the co-producer. It's ridiculous. How would you feel? And you can usually manipulate it that way.
There's nothing that business affairs can do to you that the showrunner can't overturn with a call.
Exactly.
And it's actually one of the things lies that showrunners tell us. Oh, I spoke to BA, but they're so terrible. If showrunner says bump this person up, they'll do it. That's a negotiation that you have to have a lot of sack to want to get into, you know, because it means that your work was that good. But yeah, I mean, it's like you have the worst of being in TV in 1995 and the worst of being in TV in 2016.
And also something that we always say, you know, a lot of showrunners hide behind that business affairs wall. Like, oh, my hands are, I love you, my hands are tied. If you actually love this person, you will do right by this person. Like, trust that. If they do not want to do right by you financially, they do not love you. That's the truth of the matter. You know, that's the truth of it. So really put them on the spot. You know, and challenge. It's getting tougher, but you have to these days. So,
I think you have to pick your battles when you put your showrunner on the spot.
Yes.
I think you do not want to back anybody into a corner.
that's my job, not
That's
the
right.
writer's job.
You call your people and have them back them into a wall.
But make no mistake, I mean, at whatever point you are in your career, there is nothing that business affairs ever says or does that is in no way in your best interest. They are part of a sociopathic and predatory organism whose sole interest is in profit. And I say that with all love and respect due. If they're doing their job, and it is their job is to get you as cheap as possible for as long as possible with as few outs as possible. And that's why hopefully you've got a great agent who's going to get in there and, you know, kick some ass for you.
Yeah, on this specific deal, ABC Studios deal, lower level writer, We had this is the final offer emails with, if you don't close in an hour, we're pulling the offer. And after 3 of those, we got what we wanted. So as Javi was saying, it takes
That's for like a staff level writer?
for a story editor, ESC level person.
One of the reasons they're so predatory about this now is that because the system is breaking down the way that it is, it's very likely that, you as a staff writer or executive story editor level person might wind up selling a pilot. So one of the things that you have to be very cognizant of is that sometimes you compromise things like money or title for options. The option to leave the show, the option to be in a different position, the option to have an out for this project. The part of the strategy and part of the great Wild Westness of the business right now is that anybody in this room could have a pilot next year. And how you negotiate your brand, your business, your career, you have to take a little bit more of an active step about it. When I began, it was about trying to get you as much money as you could for 22 episodes because everybody went on a show, and then you got your 13, you got your back 9 picked up, and it was trying to get you that bump on the back 9 on money because that's really all there was to negotiate about. Now, your YouTube series might become a series next year or something like that, and it really becomes about your agents being savvy about picking those battles so that, because the battle might not be for money, the battle might be to make sure that you can go and write this pilot and be supervised by this person with another studio or something like that. So these are all things that you have to think about.
LaToya and Jessica, how do you balance staffing versus development? Do you have different samples? Do you put different focus of energy at different time of year? Just what is that balance for you right now?
For me, when I'm on staff, I try to be like 110% about the show. But now that I've advanced a little bit in my career, I'm sort of dividing my time between developing new projects and also working on staff. So this is all new territory for me. So I'm just now starting to do that. But so far, so good. I've been able to balance them both.
When I first started, I was, just all in on the show. But I think on my part, it was more just like I felt like I didn't even have time to think about anything else because I was so terrified that I wasn't going to be doing a good job when I first started out. And then over the years, like once I felt more secure about like writing and having jobs and not starving in the streets, that's when I started like trying to come up with stuff to pitch, and I got interested in like developing and pitching. And so now, because I've only worked in cable, it's mostly short orders of episodes. So, I don't work on a show for 10 months out of the year, or I don't work on shows that run for 10 months out of the year. And so I'll be on a show for a few months and then I'll be done. So there's always like slots throughout the year where I will be able to pitch like when I have something. So I do try to always have stuff on the side now. And I have samples. I have a sample that's like an original, that's just meant to be a sample, and I also have a pilot that was developed, and so that's a different sample depending on what type of job that I'm going out for. And like there's always stuff on the back burner for me of like projects where it's all about timing. It's do I have time to work on this? How strongly do I feel about this? And looking at my year, does it make sense to put time into this if I know that I won't be able to pitch it for like another year?
Carole, we were talking a little about this in the green room, but the analogy I'll bring up is line cooks in restaurants right now. There's a major problem because the line cooks think they can be top chefs, and so they leave to try to do their own celebrity thing. And so restaurants are having a hard time just finding people who will basically emulate the voice of the restaurant owner. And so I'm just curious about what you've seen as, head of a couple of different programs that cover some of these different areas. What is going on out there right now with younger writers trying to write pilots or trying to staff, and how are they having different samples, and what are you seeing?
Well, it's interesting because in the Showrunner Program, people now are just pretty much writing specs because they want to get into the fellowships. I don't know that many people who are not applying to fellowships who are writing specs. I think writing a spec is a really smart idea. And there are showrunners who don't want to read your pilot. They don't care about your original voice. All they care about is, can you mimic them? Because you're there, as Javi said, you're in service of the showrunner. So I think that people, and I also, and you know, my apologies to you, Andrew. I think agents are going to try and want to get you to develop no matter what as soon as you start, because there's more money for them if you develop. I think you become a better writer. You're going to ultimately be a better showrunner if you get on staff. And managers are the same way too. So before you get representation, find out from them whether they see you as doing staffing or they just want to do, or they just want you to do development. I think you should have at least one, if not two or more, specs in your arsenal, so that when they ask to see if you can emulate their voice, you can.
And also so that if you are lucky and you sell a pilot and you wind up show running after a certain amount of time or whatever, you actually know what it's like to try to emulate somebody's voice. You know, one of the things that happens with a lot of neophyte showrunners is they've never had the experience of teaching somebody how to write them. Exactly. They've never had the experience of teaching themselves how to write somebody else. And they wind up being very upset when people can't emulate their voice, because it should be, you know, so there is a great deal of cultivating of your own craft that you now have to do independently that maybe you didn't have to when I was coming up, because there was a much bigger sort of tradition of working your way up the ladder.
I will say though that I think I've heard both. I think that you need to have both specs and pilots in your arsenal. So because the showrunners that I've worked for, they've read a feature of mine. So I was always like, oh my God, they want to read extra pages? Why? But that actually ended up being the piece that got me a lot of the jobs that I've gotten. So make sure that you have both in your arsenal.
I totally agree.
I wonder if there's a difference in that between comedy and drama, because like I've always been told to do original, and people will actively say they don't want to read regular specs, and it was actually a problem for me, because when I worked in children's TV, I had a normal spec. It was like an office spec, and I used the same old ass spec for like 5 years. It was so terrible. Like, this is how old it was. The character Andy Bernard was not in it because he didn't exist when I wrote it, but it was still getting me jobs. But my agent kept telling me, like, if you want to transition out of kids TV, like, no one is going to read this old ass office spec. Like, you have to write an original. And like it got to a point where I would go on general meetings with network execs, and they would say, this is great, I really like you, but I cannot pass you on to the showrunner, and they just will not read this. You have to have an original. And it used to be mystifying to me. I used to get so upset because I thought, like, it would make sense, like Javi said, like, wouldn't you, if you're hiring someone to mimic your show, wouldn't you want to see them exercise that skill of being able to mimic somebody else's voice? But I've talked to a couple of showrunners, and they all said it's multi-layered. One is it's the quickest way to see what you're about as a writer, you know, because everybody,
an original, you mean?
Yes, an original, because when you take the trappings of somebody else's world, somebody else's characters, somebody else's voice out of it, it's a distillation of who you are as a writer, what your sense of humor is, what your tone is, and what you're all about. And two, they don't want to read 500 office specs and 30 Rock specs. They, you know, this at least makes it a little bit more interesting when they're reading like all of the submissions.
Mike Schur was the one who said, I only want to read specs.
Regular specs.
Yeah.
That's really
I think in this and I honestly, you know a hell of a lot more about comedy than I do, because I mean, I've been a drama writer for 20 years, and the comedy world is so different. But I think in this climate you have to have both, and I think LaToya is absolutely right. Like, I used to be a big proponent of people not writing pilots, because I frankly think that pilots are like the brain surgery of television, and I think people get thrown into writing pilots too quickly, and it's a really good way of showing people your shortcomings as a TV developer and as somebody who has to create a world that has to last for many years. However, I have clearly been shown to be wrong, and I think you need to have everything in your portfolio nowadays.
Just to put some numbers on it, before I got my first job, I had written 4 TV specs, and I'd written like 3 features and 2 pilots. So just...
That's a good portfolio.
Yeah.
Andrew, what are you seeing portfolio-wise, or if someone's not working, how new does their sample need to be?
It needs to be new enough that someone hasn't read it. And, you know, if it's, I'd say 2-3 years old, you got to write something new. If you can't turn out a new piece of material every 2-3 years, I don't think it's asking too much. So, by the way, there are working writers that have been on staffs working nonstop that haven't written a new piece of material in 10+ years. It's unacceptable. It can't happen. Going back to the spec versus original thing, I would guess we send out about 1% spec material. It's 99% originals these days. I would say Mike Sherby being, one of a handful of people now that want to read original. And again, going back to thinking about the other, imagine if you are reading for your show. You create this thing that's on whatever channel. What do you want to read? And to talk about the point of, they want to read that you can mimic. They want you to prove that you can mimic someone else's show. Different people want to see different things. Some people want that. Some people, by the way, we've all staffed people that are completely the wrong person for this show, but the person just happened to love the sample. How are so many playwrights getting jobs? How are so many feature writers transitioning over to television? Right? It's not so much a 1-to-1 ratio anymore of like, I need to see exactly you can do my show for me to hire you. So
I think what LaToya said is absolutely right. You should have a plethora of different types of material in your portfolio, as well as we were talking about digital. I mean, having a link that you can send somebody of your web series. There's some people that would rather look at your web series than read your spec or your pilot.
And just to finish the spec thing up, the great thing about specs, even if people don't read them, is that they're good practice. So you want to get as close as you can to that Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hour rule as much as you can.
Yeah, if nobody will teach you, teach yourself, because there are skills you need to have in a writer's room and in a staff that sadly a lot of TV is no longer rigged to teach you, but you actually need to know.
Well, and different people tell stories different ways, and so it is helpful to sort of take apart a show.
Yeah, and I know, when I was talking about the numbers earlier of just the volume of people, it's a little intimidating, but, I totally believe in sort of the bell curve of all this stuff. Think about how many people are trying to compete for, on a cable show on Turn. How many, like 5 writers, right, on Turn? Something like, so, like, how many people were trying to get onto Turn, right? So how do you be one of those 5? If you write a spec, do you think you'll be one of those 5? If you read, what a Law and Order spec, do you think you'll be one of those 5? Think of how you can differentiate yourself.
We'll pivot from specs because I think LaToya said she wanted to finish it. But maybe you can start off.
Blame it on me, whatever.
But maybe you could start off the next section where you were kind of mentioning how you've been fortunate to have some, work with some great writers. And what has been the role of mentors in your career?
I've had some really great mentors. The showrunners that I've worked for, I worked for John Wells. You Never Forget Your First showrunner, and he was fantastic to me. I think, you don't need to just look to your showrunners, though, to be mentors. They're incredibly busy. They're running around like with chickens with their heads cut off. So look to the other co-EPs, even the staff writers that are at your level, to be your mentors as well. And also, I've actually had a really good record with executives at different companies who have been mentors to me. So that's my record with mentors.
I'd like to not only co-sign that, but also like expand on it. I think that, we're going to talk here a lot about trying to keep your job, trying to get to the next step in your job, keeping your foot in the door. The staff writer or story editor that runs to the showrunner with a problem is a problem. One of the things you need to learn about working in a staff is you're working within a hierarchy. So one of the ways that you get different ideas, that maybe you have an idea that didn't do so well in the room, or something you want to pursue, or you want to do a change on a script that's already written, but it's not that you run to the showrunner. It's that you actually talk to the executive story editor or the co-producer or the producer. Coalition building and working things up the flagpole before you go running to the boss with a complaint is a huge skill and a huge piece of diplomacy that you need to learn, especially when you're a staff writer level person. And those things also help you tremendously in staffing, and they help you tremendously in mentorship, because the showrunner does not necessarily have the time to sit with you and teach you the ropes. That's what everybody else is in the staff is there for. And a lot of people are much more mentorship minded than you think, and they really like sharing their expertise. So one of the most important things as someone who's working in a staff is don't always look to the top for the lesson. Look to the person next to you to build coalitions with, and try to use those alliances to both learn and then maybe to move the agendas that are worthy forward in the room, and or to maybe know when not to speak also.
And give back. I think that's
Yes.
really important. When you've been mentored, even if you're just a story editor, turn around and help the staff writer.
And I think that's great advice. I was fortunate enough to take a pilot writing class with a working writer who ended up getting a show by the end of it. And so I was able to sort of meet someone who was able to help me that way. Are there any other sort of like random ways, have you met a showrunner in a gym or just sort of getting out there? That might be, not a lot of writers are in gyms.
If
I realize my
for
mistake
some
there.
weird reason I'm at a gym, don't talk to me. Like, I am not going to be in a good mood. Like, do not speak to me at the. I'm never at the gym, so if that happens, you already know the seal has broken and the apocalypse is nigh. So just don't talk to me.
I'm just curious if anyone's had any interesting stories, or if not, that would also be telling as well.
I really think the key in getting jobs is just knowing someone, having someone in common with the showrunner, with the person who's hiring. Because I think pretty much almost every single one of my jobs, it's because another writer who was working on the show, or we had a mutual writer friend in common who was able to say, like, hey, read this person and meet with them because she's not a sociopath. And and that's really what it is, because this one guy told me it was his first time running a show, and he was like, being on this side of the desk, like, the one thing I've realized now is how important that is, because he showed me, he was like, look at the stack, and it was like a stack from the floor to here, and there were 5 of those stacks, and they were all samples of people wanting to get hired on his show. And he was like, I can't read that because I'm also trying to make a show, And he was like, and if anybody in my life that I trust says, hey, here's one that you should read first, I'm definitely going to read that one first instead of going through I'm going to read the 5,000 and then read that one. Like, he's like, if there's any indication that something should be on the top of the stack, I'm definitely going to take that.
There's a dude named Andy Reeser who was he's a co-EP on Grey's Anatomy now, and a lovely guy, and he came to work on The Middleman with me, and the reason I hired him was because I had worked on Charmed for 2 seasons, and then like 8 people from Charmed send me emails about him, and I literally just brought him in for a meeting, and I said, if I hire you, can you just get those people to stop bothering me? But I think it's really important. It's like if somebody who knows the showrunner or somebody the showrunner respects can send them an email saying, hey, this is a good person, and especially if it's multiple people. So I think that's a big part of it too, is your coworkers become your I don't know how to network people. Jose Molina, who's another guy who's a Puerto Rican who I do a podcast with, and I were talking about this in a recent, I don't know how to network. I'm socially awkward, and I'm not I don't know what to do with my hands and stuff, So what is networking? Most of the networking I've done is that I'm on staffs with people that I like, and then they like me, and then we all recommend each other for shit, and that's pretty much how the whole thing runs. And that starts with your peer community, it starts with your writers group, it starts with the people you're an assistant with and all that. And that trail of goodwill that you foment throughout your career and your professional experience is ultimately what's going to get you to the second half of your career.
Also, the moment you leave that showrunner meeting, you need to be emailing all those friends, telling them that to email Javi.
To follow up for you.
Yes.
Yeah, and also a writer's recommendation has so much more weight than anybody else's, because that's someone who's worked with you, has been in a room with you 70 hours a week, and knows the ins and outs of what it's like working with you. And of course, that person's opinion of you is going to be much higher than somebody else.
I think I think everything is correct here, but
Thank you.
I think there's a slight difference between comedy and drama. Comedy is so much more insular in the drama world. The drama world is expanding at such an alarming rate that in a way the comedy is not quite at the same pace. So that there's still certain camps that if you come up through a certain camp, you can get a lot of leeway through that, whether it's Harvard Lampoon or UCB or so on and so forth, whatever, maybe, Parks and Rec, for any number of shows. Like the camps are so strong. With drama, it's not quite as clear cut. So I think if you're a comedy writer, it's so much more important to keep in touch with your peers, because who knows? Whereas drama, it's a little bit spreading out more. So.
Man, the Harvard Lampoon, that's such a mafia. If any of you guys are Harvard Lampoon people, get the fuck out. You don't need this. Just call up your Harvard Lampoon buddies and have them get you a job. Ugh.
I also know someone from UCB is here, and you're not welcome. No, but I think that's a very interesting point. I mean, these camps are very important, and at the same time, you can come up in one camp, but I also think, networking is friend making, guys, and now you're all my friends. It's an interesting road out there where you are building your brand, and you have to take sort of a corporate mentality to it. But then sometimes we're uncomfortable people, and it feels awkward and weird. I don't have a question to go off of that, but if anyone wants to contribute to anything.
I will say though, whenever I would go to those mixers and try to meet people, I also just tried to meet cool people. It wasn't necessarily about like building a brand. So just try to go with people who like Game of Thrones, who watch, all the shows you watch that you can. I'm wearing a Game of Thrones t-shirt. What are you talking about? So yeah, just go with people who you actually like, and then good things will happen.
Yeah, a genuine connection. I hate the word networking. I think it's a dirty word. I really like the word connecting. And don't worry about meeting every single person in the room and going up to them and saying, what can you do for me? One of the best things to do about connecting is when you're talking to the person, think about what you can do for them. And that sort of takes the pressure off instead of worrying what they can do for you. And only spend time with people where there's a real connection. Talking about Game of Thrones.
And look, I got an head start. Does that mean I have a twice? I can tell you what the shows were.
That means you're all good.
But no, and I think that's really important. It's about, look, the best way to get over not being hired on a show is when you walk out of the showrunner meeting and you really hate the showrunner. If you don't get the job, that's a good thing, or if there's people with whom you don't genuinely vibe, or whatever. It's like you can spend so much time trying really hard to get along with people that you would not normally make friends with. And sometimes you are lucky and you get the job, and then you find out, well, I don't like this person so much. But as with the pilot script, you find the things to like about them, But really, in terms of the networking and all of that, it's about being with people and vibing with people that you would normally vibe with. If you don't, it's not worth pushing because it's not going to go anywhere.
We all have something in common. We all love TV and film, so at the very least we can connect on what we're watching. Well, we used to be able to connect on what we're watching. Now it's like season 2 of whatever. But assistants play a role in this process as well, and I'm just sort of wondering if anyone's had any good experience with executive assistants or showrunners assistants, or just sort of, it's about that process of standing out of the pile of, 500, and they can be the gatekeeper sometimes, and it's part of paying it forward. So it's not necessarily making friends up.
Be nice to the assistants because they have their boss's ear. And, when I've hired people, I've always said to my assistant, how were they? And if they said, this guy was a dick, they didn't get the job. Because even if I like them in the interview, if they can't treat my assistant right, and those assistants today are going to be showrunners later, they're going to be executives later, and remember their names, be nice to them, send them presents.
But also be nice to assistants just to be a decent human being.
Oh, yeah, that too.
Yes.
Out of curiosity, how many people were assistants here? I'm just... Yeah, okay. All right. It's about like half maybe for the cameras. I don't know. I'm eyeballing this. I'm not good at math. Anything else that we haven't touched on before maybe I open up to questions a little bit early because there's so many people here? This has been very exhaustive so far, I feel.
In a good way, though.
Yeah, in a good way.
I just want to say that at CBS, and Erica knows this, we have a night called the Cone of Silence Night where alumni come back and they talk about what it really takes to get asked back the second year. And you guys are all on staff, so chime in absolutely. Leonard Chang, who is now doing development and was on Justified, he was always first in the morning, last one out at night. And then he started working for a showrunner that slept at the office. And so he would still come in at 7:30 in the morning to be there when the showrunner got up, and they could start to talk and just throw ideas back and forth. The reason that the people who get asked back from all the things I've heard from writers who have done that is because they become undeniable, because they become totally invaluable. They will do whatever needs to be done. They'll do research. They'll write sides. They'll go in and see, how can I help you? It's really about how can I make other people's lives easier? And then when it comes time to ask whether or not they want to pay for you for next season, you have to make it so that they have to say yes, that they can't do it without you. Even as a staff writer, you want to make sure that you're invaluable. But you guys have been on staff, and you've all made it past that. So what's your experience of it?
The critical faculty develops earlier in everyone than the creative faculty, especially now in the age of blogging and Twitter and all that, where you can basically, write 142 words going, oh, Batman v Superman sucked! Well, guess what I don't want to hear from pretty much anyone in a writer's room, but especially like lower levels, is that's not good. That doesn't work for me. I don't give a damn what works for you. I give a damn about whether you have a pitch to fix something that you can prove to me doesn't work. And, you know, the fastest way toward the darkest pit of my personal hell is to be there with a writer that I call a Dr. No, especially if they're not an experienced writer. On a show I worked on, there was one piece of show canon that was flawed, but that was basically on the show canon for about a month and a half. And a staff writer had the gall to come in with a list of 10 things that staff writer didn't think worked about that idea. And I'm like, well, do you have, you made a list, do you have a list of 10 things to beat the idea that you dislike so much? No, shut the fuck up. Don't want to hear it, because it's condescending, it's terrible, and you're basically saying, I'm willing as a staff writer to hold this room hostage with my taste, but your taste isn't what matters. What matters is your ability to create and your ability to pitch solutions. And especially at the lower level, if you want to be a good citizen of the writer's room, knowing the moment when you express what you think personally of an idea, and knowing the moment when you express what you feel is a fix for something that you may not feel works, is crucial. And more so than anything else, that comes across as your attitude. You know, you may be the cheeriest person, but if everything you say is no, I don't like this, at a certain point, everybody just goes like, God, every time they open their mouth, it's to say no, you know? That says more about you than any facet of your personality and how you present yourself.
Yeah, the fix it or beat it kind of solution is also a good way for. So basically, more often than not, I'm the only woman in the room and also the only person of color in the room. And it's very hard because you kind of pull double duty, because I can't not think about that and have that be part of my identity, you know? And so oftentimes there's these tired ass like jokes about minorities. There's these like terrible sexist, like tried and true like 80s jokes, you know, and it's like, I don't want to be the PC police, and obviously I'm the only person in the room who's going to care about it, you know, and I feel very protective of all of that. And I feel like it is my responsibility to speak up because I am the only representation in the room. But I also don't want to be the PC police, and I don't want to be the wet blanket who's always being like, oh, let's not do that, you know. And so the only way you can not be that is to just beat the joke. You have to be like, okay, well, how about this? How about this? Like, here's 5 other jokes that are way better than that, like, 80s sounding joke, you know? And that's the only way you can do it. And it really sucks because as the only woman or as the only person of color, you basically are constantly working double time, because not only are you focusing on trying to be funny, you're also focusing on, am I representing my people, you know? Sorry, that was kind of a down note.
No, and honestly, I think it's our duty as other members in the writer's room to be aware and a little bit more proactive about that. And I also think it goes a little bit to what Javi was saying earlier about the coalition building, is that sometimes the room might not be the place to say it, going to the showrunner might be not be the place to say it, but a side room with the person that you trust on the staff, you can kind of have a little bit of a workshop conversation of like, can we beat this? Can we do, what about this? You know, and just sort of be proactive that way. I would like to open up to questions because we have so many people here tonight, but sort of remembering Javi's, don't be critical of the panel, guys, okay? Let's be productive.
You can be critical of the panel, but, you know.
But we'll get
Work
you.
again.
You know, you've seen how shy and retiring I am.
To go back to the conversation about specs versus originals and that kind of thing, if you've been on a show and you're trying to get that next job on a show and you have originals but you have shows you wrote for the existing show, does that kind of count as like a spec? Because it's like, I was able to follow someone else's voice. The last show I worked on, because I was working on a show for 2 years, and in my free time I wrote my pilots, but I didn't have time to write a Brooklyn Nine-Nine or whatever, but I can use the show that I was on as my
But nobody knows who was involved in writing that script.
Oh.
They don't know if the room wrote it. They don't know if you really wrote it. I don't think, I mean, Andrew, you tell us. I don't think that can work as your spec.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes people say, like, oh, it's a writer's first draft, but ultimately, you know, where the ideas come from, and you never know whose voice actually went into it, so.
Even like a drama? Okay.
I was a studio development assistant, and my boss generally would ask for another sample.
Yeah.
Instead of being critical, I was going to be complimentary of the panel. It's been so balanced and even. It's like the perfect writer's room to listen to you guys. My question is a little bit about news and using it to your advantage. I was wondering if you could speak of just strategies that you use when you look at news or, download podcasts or look at blogs or other reference materials.
To write a story, you mean, or?
Not just write a story, but also just what you use in your own process as a writer to just gather information and improve your work or improve your brand or your strategies.
You mean like to connect or to possibly,
Yeah, to connect.
What I'll use the news for, maybe I'll start, is it's always great to send a congratulations email to someone. That's the first thing I'll do. The other thing I might do is if I see a piece of news, I'll just send it to my agent and be like, what's going on with this? Like, where are they at? That's part of what we were talking about earlier, where it's 450, 500 shows, where your personal relationships are. So that's how I'll proactively use the news, in addition to like research for meetings of like, what have they done recently? What have they talked about? What are their interviews?
By the way, there's so many interviews right now, podcasts, whatever. Email someone that you don't know, saying you heard them on some interview or you read something about them. Like, people love to be complimented. Use it as an opportunity to reach out to someone you don't know. You watched this episode of whatever, you thought it was great. See if you can get that person's info and email them. Congratulations. I'm sure no one else is doing that. I do that all the time. I cold email all the time. Do that.
Children of Tendu, Javi's, is an incredible podcast.
And it's free. So please listen to free. So no, we're never going to charge for it because you can't. No, but you know what? There are so many podcasts out there for screenwriters and all of that sort of stuff. And I think ultimately, I think I have about 20 different sort of sources of news and information that I just sort of cycle through every day, like obsessively, And
What are they?
God, the browser, Slate, IO9. Although Charlie Jane Anders just left IO9, so I don't know if I'm going to continue with them. Yeah, she's going to work on her novel. I know. Badass Digest, Slash Film, Vulture, Vox, Medium, Long Reads. The list goes on, and of course 77 for design stuff, Moco Loco for design. There's a lot of like design stuff, and honestly, like. I think that one of the things that the internet does is that it allows you to be a much better citizen of the world. Like, it allows you to really narrow down whatever your focuses are, but it also allows you to like know a lot, have a lot more broader knowledge and so on. And I think that one of the more important thing is that you don't necessarily have to listen to all the screenwriting podcasts. We're all giving some version of very similar information. You can decide whether you like, me and Jose or John August and Craig Mason or whoever, and just listen to whichever one you like best. But I think in terms of everything else, it's just a question of making yourself as well-rounded so that when you walk into that showrunner meeting, if they throw a reference that you might not have gotten in the time before the internet, for those of you who existed back then, you might get it now. And I think that it's just another way of being a better Renaissance person and a better citizen of the world,
While we're talking podcasts, Third and Fairfax is the WGA podcast. It is fantastic, guys. Please check it out.
Yeah, two quick questions. One, you talked about spec scripts. One, if you're a writing team, how is that viewed? Because it's two people. And the other one is you want to approach somebody and you get anybody on Facebook. What about like contacting somebody on Facebook? If you're not their friend, obviously. Yeah.
I would recommend against Facebook. Different platforms have different codes to them. Twitter is a little bit more approachable, where you can say, hey, saw your episode, it's great. Facebook, frankly, if you're not friends with the person, it goes straight to the other. And for a lot of writers who maybe didn't grow up with Facebook, it can be seen as a little intrusive, I think.
I just have a rule of thumb for my Facebook is, if I haven't met you in person, I'm probably not going to friend you or accept your friend request. But I'm all about Twitter. So if you connect with me on Twitter, I would likely answer. And that's actually where I get all my news. So.
Yeah, because Facebook is very personal. That's where you're posting like life events and like photos of your family and things like that. It does feel very intrusive when people like reach out on Facebook. And I do think that Twitter is like kind of the standard of how you reach out and talk to strangers.
Yeah, teams I've heard good, it's good, sort of the 2-for-1 deal. I do think you want to make sure it's a long-term commitment to the team and that it's not just a one-off script, because neither of you can do anything with a one-off script. Whereas if you are dedicated to a multi-year partnership, then you guys can work together, I feel.
Yeah, because when you're a team, you're basically treated as one entity. But if you split off from that person, you can't use your script that you both wrote on, because it's impossible to delineate like what was yours and what you just have to write a new one if you go off on your own.
When you're a team, I think, this is something I'm literally just working out right now, so forgive me if I don't sound entirely cogent, but I think it probably bears some investigation of what your persona is like as a team and how you might function in a writer's room. One of the things that happens a lot with teams, especially younger teams, is that they maybe haven't quite figured out how they're because you're two brains that have to talk to each other. They haven't always figured out how that dynamic works in the context of the writer's room. And that sometimes can be really tricky because you still have two individuals and very different points of view and all that. And I find the teams that are more successful are ones where it's not that they function as one entity in the writer's room necessarily, but that their dynamic is very clear to them, and they're able to successfully translate what that collaborative dynamic is into a larger collaborative environment. There's nothing worse than when you're writing with a team and then the team starts fighting, and then you got to sit there and listen to these people fight it out on their own before they can actually pitch something. So I think that if you're actively working in a writing team, it's probably not a bad idea to, previous to staffing, or if you've already staffed, actually spend some time just having that conversation between yourselves. What do we sound like? Who are we in the room? What is our dynamic? How do we project that positively in the room?
How important do you think social media is for writers? I mean, obviously when you're on a show, it's nice to tweet about your episode, what's going on behind the scenes. But if you're not on a show, like, how important is it to have a Twitter presence, have an Instagram, things like that?
I just killed a lesbian character on The 100. And social media was really interesting for the last 8 weeks for me. And it has been fascinating because it has been a study in the contrast between what studios think is the correct role of the writer in terms of the PR of a show, what networks feel that way, what showrunners feel their role is. And one of the things that happened in this is that the studio and network didn't really have a social media policy for this show, and they didn't want us talking to the press about it. They were very specific. We're not going to do any more press on this episode. We're done talking about this. But the fewer, I feel like they had a fundamental misunderstanding of what the controversy on social media meant. And I think that if you are a lower level writer on a show, you do a lot better to consult with people who are in the higher up about what you're going to say or not say on social media, to really, really think those things through very carefully, and to not. It is very easy to get seduced by the instant fame of social media when you're on a staff, and it is such an easy way of going out and saying too much, giving away too much, saying something inappropriate, compromising the show in some way. You have to really kind of control yourself with that sort of thing. And my experience as a higher level person on a show that stumbled into a really horrible controversy that exposed a great deal of pain in our audience base was, I basically took something of a calculated risk to really engage the audience. And I think that worked out well, at least with my relationship with the audience. I'm not sure how well it worked out with my relationship with the studio. But I think that what happened on The 100 specifically, I think, is a case study in a lot of us acting as individuals really sort of courting the audience in a way that wound up looking very bad for us. So especially early on, where things relate to the IP of the studio, the IP of your showrunner, you do much better off trying to very sort of carefully modulate that and be very careful about what you say and really try to just run it up the food chain.
Well, in going into meetings, trying to build up your presence, I think there might be a difference in comedy and drama, whereas in comedy, I feel like people are like, have they written a joke recently? And I've, had a lot of advice as to like sort of having multiple jokes a day on a Twitter outlet. I don't know if the same would be true of drama and just sort of having the volume out there. I'd be curious.
Yeah, I mean, what would you write tweeting about drama-wise?
Or
like
emo tweets.
Heartbreaking tales of like human suffering. But in comedy, it's very different because people actually get hired based on Twitter. Like people with really, really active, good Twitter accounts where they tweet like 1 million jokes a day, and they get these followings of like comedians and like writers and stuff like that. People really get hired based on Twitter.
Well, and honestly, too, maybe if you have a fun Twitter account, that might be a nice selling point. You know, if you have a couple of jokes in there and you're a drama writer, they're like, oh, this is what they're like in a room. So maybe there's some value there.
Basically, anytime you do something and you put it out there in the world, like, somebody will find you if it's really good, you know? And I feel like that's just Twitter's function, is that as a comedy writer, you can throw out jokes, and if they're really, really consistently good, like, people will find their way to you. That being said, I have not done that.
So if you're not working at the moment, anything you can do to enhance your digital presence is a positive.
This question is for Andrew or anyone else. Hi, Carol. Anyone else who can answer. Can you talk about the trend of paper teaming with staff writers and what that means for staff writers and how we should take it when that's presented to us?
Well, technically it's illegal for the WGA. But, you know, it's a growing trend in certain kinds of shows, especially kids shows. So at Disney and Nickelodeon, it's a pretty common thing. It's a way to save money, you know. I always argue in favor of not doing it, but it's ultimately up to the writer. If you can afford not to do it, you know, because that, you know, ultimately how I sort of present it is, let's just say the option of to paper team versus not to do it. If you do it, what do you really gain there? First of all, it's probably a show with a very limited budget, meaning Nickelodeon, Disney. Where does that take you in the next year, 2 years, 5 years? Where do you want to be? If you don't do it, can you afford that? And sort of playing at both scenarios. And, you know, it's a very personal question. I can't answer the question for you specifically, but you got to take a long, hard look at that.
What is paper teaming?
Paper teaming is essentially pairing two independent writers in a false union to be paid as one entity.
I was wondering, Jessica, you touched on this a little bit before, how you're often the only woman. Can you use that to your advantage in getting jobs, or is it always kind of a protective?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times I go out on meetings, staffing meetings or stuff, specifically, and this is not great, specifically because they're like, oh, the studio or the network told us we had to have a woman. And it's like, great way to start a meeting, guys. So good to meet you, you know? Yeah, I mean, that happens a lot, and it's like, and you can tell on shows where, like, all the female characters are, like, really cool chick, like, who's super nice. And like that's her entire personality, and they're like, fix it. And I was like, write a human being and then name her Allison, you know? Like, it's not that. Have you never met a woman before in your life? Like, this is insane. Like, that happens all the time. But what I will, and I also get asked, do you feel pressure to be one of the guys? And the thing is, like, you shouldn't, because the entire room is literally filled with guys. And no matter what, you're not going to be a man. Like, you can't turn yourself into a man. That's not your life experience, you know? And why would you? Because you're being hired, hopefully, because you're you. And the only voice that isn't represented in an entire room of men is a woman. And that's who you are. So you have experience as a woman that none of them have. And they'll never be a woman. And there are things that they'll never know what it's like to be a woman, you know? So that's your value. You are arguably the most valuable person in that room at that point, because none of them will ever know what it's like to live life as you. And I think that's the power of being the woman in the room.
But would you also say that it's probably a good idea not to only be writing the women characters, that you want to be able to write all the characters so they don't just come to you and pigeonhole you as he did the Asian writer?
Yeah.
What would an Asian person do in this situation?
Yeah, I mean, there aren't enough Asian shows for them, anyone to want to do that. No, it's true. I mean, oftentimes that's why I get hired, but that doesn't mean I'm only pitching jokes for a female character. You know, like, I'm doing my job as a writer first and as a female writer second, you know, because you have to, I mean, that is part of your job. It does suck because depending on the show, they do try to kind of pigeonhole you a little bit.
I think we had, yeah.
So you guys spoke a bit earlier about the more egalitarian nature of selling pilots now. Does that have any impact if someone has sold a pilot to a network? Does that have any impact on what position they could hope to get if they're going back out staffing?
I've had several friends who have sold pilots first before they ever got a staff writing job, and that was the gateway to them getting their first staff writing job. So write the pilots and hopefully get them out there, because that could be your window.
I think the secret is to not try to be a co-EP because you sold a pilot. I think it's really tempting to be like, well, I sold a pilot to CBS, I should be a co-EP on the show, and then you end up being a co-EP and like without the experience that you're expected to have, you just are a very expensive person who has very little experience. And I think that it's a unique sort of position that people find themselves where they sold a pilot and then they want to just go in and go to staffing. But you have to have a very frank conversation with your representation about what level you want to go in, what kind of responsibilities you want to have, and what you feel you can handle. A really good example of somebody who did a really good job of doing that is Richard Haddam, who he's very well known. He teaches at UCLA. He's been on the ranks of many shows. But the first thing he did was he had sold this movie and then he sold a pilot. But he very specifically went back in to staff on shows, and he's made a lot of his career in staffing also, in addition to selling his own pilots. And I think that he did a very good job of kind of, going it in a good place after having sold a pilot and been, co-executive producer of his own show, but also, knowing that he had a row to hoe after having had that experience.
I think something Javi touched on earlier is absolutely right. Sort of the horizontal growth of the industry has given more opportunities to first-time writers than any other time in television history. At the same time, I think it's totally right. Development and staffing shouldn't be viewed as two completely separate entities these days. One feeds the other. The more you develop, the more those executives you develop will want to staff you. The more those producers you develop will want to staff you. Similarly, the more you staff, the more the networks will want to develop with you. So you shouldn't view them as two completely independent things anymore.
Rob, I think the lady in red was first. Absolutely. Thank you.
And there's a song about her, so.
Hey, I just had a question about something that hasn't really come up yet, and that is the reality, if it's even a possibility, of crossing over comedy to drama, and sort of how you reconcile that with, like, what is your voice, and have your portfolio reflect your specific, game or whatever you bring to the table. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I think it's much easier to go from comedy to drama. In fact, I've never heard, how about you guys, of any drama writer that said, wow, I really want to write comedy after all. And I think that if you are going from comedy to drama, you have to have something in your portfolio that shows that you can do it. And it is a very valuable commodity, and Andrew, you speak to this also, somebody who can write drama with a light touch. So I think it's a plus. What do you think, Andrew?
I think it's not just comedy to drama. It's also, as what was previously touched on, executives are incredibly small-minded. They want to hire a woman to write female characters. They want to hire a minority to write minority. They want to hire a gay writer to write. Literally, there's a show right now, Real O'Neill's, that's staffing at ABC. They're literally looking for someone who can speak to that specific show, because if you're not gay, you can't write gay. Like, it's simple as that. I mean, it sounds crazy, but the executives are very small-minded. And so it's not just comedy to drama. It's also, if you're a genre writer, can you write soap? If you're a procedural writer, can you write deep character? So again, you have to lead with, you have to prove people wrong, right? You have to show them that I can do it, and it's up to you to write your way into that arena. People aren't going to think of you for that. You have to prove to them wrong.
One caveat I'd like to add to that is, if you're a straight white man, you apparently can write for everybody.
Yes.
This question is about our little extra handout here. Wish you were getting more meetings. Probably everyone in this room is yes. And this question specifically goes to something that Javi mentioned about someone that he hired getting lots of calls from 8 different people that you were interconnected with. Is that too much? And was that before getting the meeting, after getting the meeting, both from?
No, it actually made me read him.
Right.
And I gotta tell you, like, if somebody responds badly to getting 8 emails about you, then you shouldn't want to work for them. I mean, I think that if any writer manages to get 8 people to write nice things about them, my God, like that means that when you strip out the 3 of those 8 people who are probably sociopaths, there's still like 5 who are really nice people, Yeah, I mean, no, absolutely. Like, I mean, but the thing is, you have to. But look, that's a favor you're asking from somebody. So you have to make sure that you really want that job. And that's sort of and one of the things that in Andy's case was that some of those people knew me really well. He talked to them about me, and they're like, "Oh, you guys get along. We're gonna do, and all that." But I write a lot of cold emails to other showrunners about writers that I believe in strongly. That and most of those emails are about, this is one out of the 58 people that you have on top of your desk. This is why you should maybe clear up some other scripts and look at that. So honestly, you should use every weapon in your arsenal to try to get noticed, because otherwise, what's the point of having the weapons?
Yeah, and I would say, like, save your big gun for the job you really, really want, because you don't want to have to call in that favor more than once.
And I think that you should have people on both sides, people who are calling on your behalf before sending emails, so that you actually get read, and then after they meet with you, who can vouch for you and say, yeah, you liked him in the meeting and he's really terrific.
I have a really quick practical question. You mentioned having headshots. Should teams have a headshot of themselves as a team or as individuals?
I have never been asked that question before. Well, I think you should show the picture of you, which is two of you.
Have your partner superimposed floating over you.
I think you can be individuals. I really do.
It's more like they're going to look at you on Facebook. So, you want to make sure that first photo they look at is, like my photo on Tumblr is actually a cartoon of me that's based on another writer saying that I have a 150-pound head. So it's like this massive head, and then people get mad at me because I don't look like I don't know.
Oh, you should do a photo where it's you and your partner and you're doing back-to-back crossed arms.
Yes, agreed.
That's original.
Preferably wearing the same suits as the Bee Gees on the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack. Yeah, it was pretty good.
My question is about developing. If you're currently on a show, I'm currently on a show, but feel like when I'm not actively writing during the season, should be developing. And are you developing pitches or just writing spec pilots, or what is the wisdom? Both.
Yes. Look, there was a showrunner that I worked with many years ago who I just absolutely hated. He was like the worst person that I've ever, and I worked with some really bad people, and this dude was pretty awful. And I remember, like, I would call my agent 3-4 times a day, and he'd talk me off the ledge. And one time I was like, I don't understand why this guy sold a pilot and got the show on the air, Jesus! And my agent goes, because he always has a new piece of material. And I'm like, excuse me? And he goes like, this guy that you hate so much, and with probably good reason, every year he's got a new spec pilot. Every year he sells a pilot. Every year he's got a pitch, and that's the thing about being entrepreneurial is that, ultimately the only thing that you have control over in this business is going to be the material that you generate for yourself to try to sell for yourself. And whether for you that takes the form of, I'm going to do this one as a pitch, that one's a pilot, this one as a comic book, that one as a web series, this one as a podcast, this one as a series of confrontational spoken word performance monologues. You should have a love of doing for the sake of doing that makes those things happen anyway, and it really just becomes about continuing to finish work to the greatest extent possible. And that's what's going to, that activity creates the fertility of your career.
I had the advice to have a development grid for myself, like they do at the studios and networks for all their projects, but what am I working on, what's next, what's, just sort of down at the bottom. So I always think it's helpful to have not only the next one, but what's the one after that, and how are you building out your portfolio in different ways?
My question's actually for Andrew. I got really lucky. I got hit by lightning, literally, and got my first staffing position coming up as an assistant. And I have no representation at all. And I know it's almost impossible to get my second job without representation. Do I send query letters? I mean, do I enter contests? Do I send you gift baskets and muffins? I mean, how do I get representation?
It's actually pretty similar to what we were talking about earlier with recommendations. Writers want to trust people that they know, whether it's a friend or it's another writer they respect or it's an executive, whomever. Something that we talk about a lot is figure out who the point of contact should be to make something happen, whether it's helping a client get a job, it could be an assistant, it could be a friend of a friend, whoever the point of contact is to get to accomplish your goal. figure that out. So if you want to get signed by an agent, figure out who is that person for you. Is it to have Javi or someone you know recommend you to the specific person? So that's something we talk about a lot.
I would say also, like, you've already been on the show, so maybe some of the writers that you've worked with, you've developed a relationship with them. You can talk to them about maybe possibly sending your work to their rep or getting a contact that way.
Real quick, just to follow up, Andrew, one of the reasons why I was so excited you agreed to do this panel is that you have worked at both a small and a large agency. And, I think one of the questions, too, for people is, at what point do you maybe want to look at other representation? And what are just sort of the benefits? And maybe you can speak to that quickly, too.
Other representation in terms of, like, leaving your current agent or
adding management or lawyers. I mean, any of it.
Agents, managers, lawyers, they have very different functions. So it's up to you to figure out what you want out of your representation. An agent, simply by definition, gets you employment, whatever that means. They keep food on the table. Managers, I talk about in sort of three different ways. And the best managers, I think, embody all three of these things. There's the kind of managers up there that are former agents, and they act as someone that's going to get you out there, get you meetings, get you activity, get your name out there. There are managers who basically act as your personal development executive. They're probably not going to set up a ton of meetings, probably not going to make a ton of new introductions, but they'll read everything you do, go over your ideas, go over your pitches, and all that stuff. And then the latter, there are managers who sort of just talk you through what is the bigger strategy, what is the bigger game plan on a day-to-day, month-to-month basis, just to make sure that you're on track to hit the goals that you want to accomplish this year, this next year, so on and so forth. The best managers accomplished all three, but more often than not, managers usually embody one over the other. And in terms of lawyers, the lawyer really is there to function as someone that can take you to the next level, specifically for development. Their understanding of the back end should be more sophisticated than your agent or manager, so that they're actually paying for themselves. Again, it all kind of blends together at a certain point, because if your manager or your agent is competent, then they should be able to, provide that service. But technically, I'm not providing legal, services for you as a lawyer would. In terms of representation, different points in your career, you're going to want different things. There's a lot of A-list writers who don't have agents. There's a lot of people who don't have managers. Figure out what you want out of your presentation. That'll sort of dictate what roles you can fill those.
You also want to do a little bit of agenting your agent. When I first sat down with both my agents and my managers and we talked about what kind of career I wanted to have, I was very specific that I wanted to work in both television and film. So there came a point where I was working a lot in television, but I wasn't doing anything in film. So we had to have a come to Jesus about that. We had to sit down and have a talk, because I was like, this is going really well, but I really still want to do this other piece. So you have to really force their hands and know what kind of career you want to build. What is your brand? How you are going to be the CEO of your own company, and really force them to do the things that you need them to do.
And also just tell them what you're into and what you want to do, because then they also don't waste their time trying to push you on things that you aren't going to want to take anyway, Like when it's pilot season, like make a list of the shows that you are excited about, and so they know what they're going to go after, instead of trying to like push you onto 70 different things where you may or may not like it.
And make sure you have material to back up what it is that you want to do, because it's not fair to ask your representation, say, I want to get on that show, but I don't have anything that would be suitable for that show, but I can really do it. You need to have it in the material as well.
Just real quick, I'm going to plug the Friends book, How to Manage Your Representation by Chad Gervich. It is fantastic. I think we have time for one more question, if anyone...
I had one. This is sort of off of managing your reps and also the question about developing when you're on staff, because I've recently finding out about the contractual difficulties of being able to actually develop something when you're on staff. And I've tried to carve out, little windows to develop certain projects, but I've also been told I have basically zero negotiating power at the bottom level and sort of take what I'm given. And I say, thank you very much. I'm lucky to have that. So how do you reconcile, how do you advocate for really any aspect of your career when you're so lucky to just get your foot in the door and to be there?
Well, there's development from you can develop always in your free time and not get paid for it and just be writing for yourself, and there's development to be paid for. Obviously, you can't be paid for something while you're writing on staff, for the most part while you're at the lower level. But you should always be writing for yourself. You should always, as Javi was saying, the day you actually stop writing for yourself, what are you doing? You came into this business because you wanted to be a writer. The day you stop writing for yourself, you are no longer a writer, literally,
It's very interesting and sobering. I'm going to go home and write.
You have to get real. That's my role here.
It's so true.
And I think one of the just to drift off of that is that, so we're talking about shorter orders. You're going to be on a show for 10 episodes, 13 episodes. When I was coming up, you get your job, you get 13, you get a back 9. That's your whole year. And especially at the lower levels, you do have a development lock on your contract. But the fact of the matter is that you don't know. You could be on 4 or 5 shows in a 2-3 year career. And that's a truth of television now. So basically, the work that you're doing independently as a self-starter, because you're entrepreneurial, because there's something you want to express and all of that, and this may be the song of your soul as opposed to what you're doing in your day job. Now more than ever, it's a question of weeks, of months, if not weeks, that you might be able to actually go out and sell that. So the work that you do in terms of staying a writer is work that might be paying your rent a lot sooner than it was in 1995, because shows don't last as long, the windows are smaller, the orders are shorter, the staffs are smaller, and that's what we started. The whole thing we started with is you have to be more entrepreneurial. And because right now the business is so wide open and it's so strange and there are so many weird nooks and crannies that the only thing you can do is have the piece of material ready that to meet the opportunity when it presents itself, because the only thing you can control is having the piece of material. The opportunities now are more than ever. Anyone might step up at any time, and you just have to make sure you're ready to hand it your script.
And I'll say, I kind of resent the term managing your agent.
I think she said agenting your agent.
Worse, it's even worse. We're going wrong direction. But the key, I'll tell you, sort of the number one thing that gets any agent going is when you call them and say, my new script is ready. There is not a single call that is more exciting to get from a client than that. So if you actually want to agent your agent, do that consistently. There's nothing more you can do.
All right, I think we're out of time. I don't want to hold our panel any longer. Guys, our panel has been fantastic. Please, standing ovation for them. Thank you guys so much for taking the time and being on our panel tonight. Thank you all for coming here. Please listen to Third and Fairfax. Come to other committee meetings and other panels, and thank you so much.